This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal Podcast, we are joined by Martha Engber. She is the author of a new book called Bliss Rose from Vine Leaves Press. She's this book is rather interesting because it is her experience as a daughter of a parent with undiagnosed autism. And as an autistic person, I'm excited to see this experience, see it from the other side, see what the holistic experience of autistic people is, and understand the challenges with all of that and kind of hear her story. So this promises to be incredibly interesting. So we'll dive right in with Martha. Hello, Martha. Welcome to the Cameron Journal Podcast.
Hi, Cameron. Thanks for inviting me. I was
Thank
looking
you.
forward to it
Yes.
too.
Yes. So I want to kind of dive right into the deep end of the pool. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your dad?
He was born in a blue-collar town in Alton, Illinois, which is right across from St. Louis.
Mhm.
And he had five kids in his family, Catholic, working class, and at a time, 1930. And so there was, of course, that was years and decades before the diagnosis actually came out for Asperger's syndrome, which it's not called in this country anymore. It's called autism spectrum disorder. But that didn't come out till about 1991. And so for most of his life, he was autistic and just handling life as he could. And so for most people growing up during that time, he was considered quirky. And that was typically the term used for people who had Asperger's at that time. You know, they may have had unusual eating habits, for example, or get into fall into rages for no apparent reason, and so forth. The symptoms that we typically are listed for autism at this time. So, and it wasn't until that my nephew, who was, I believe, 2 at the time, was diagnosed with Asperger's, and again, it's now considered autism spectrum disorder or ASD in 1993 that he that the possibility became apparent that my dad might have undiagnosed autism, because typically it is hereditary. And so it's something that we hadn't contemplated until my mother fell ill, and my dad had a very hard time with it. And so my sisters and I, when we were considering things, we said, "Hey, this is probably where this came from." So that is my dad.
All right. Well, that is quite difficult. So, and I can only imagine the the layers of family drama with all of this. Um, this isn't Dr. Phil, though. We're not going to go there. So the next, but where I do want to go is, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, when I realized essentially after, there's always some incident which tends to blow up a situation, right? That you didn't know was even there. And when my mother died, that was rather it. My mother, I hadn't realized, was a buffer between my dad and us all growing up. She would kind of ease the rough patches. And because of that, when she died, I realized that in order to deal with my dad and protect myself, that I essentially created a mask, right, that I used to for the public as well, so I just didn't understand who I necessarily was. So it affected my self esteem to a pretty deep capacity. And I realized my mother just really didn't know me. She ended up dying, and she didn't know me, and I didn't know me. And so it kind of led to this very deep crisis that took about 10 years to figure out. And so that's when I was trying to figure it out, I was looking up therapists, and I said, therapists who deal with the kids of autistic people. Nothing. There was nothing. There were no books on it. I ran into
Oh,
literally a handful of articles that were about the experience of an allistic, that's a non-autistic child of a autistic person. And there was just nothing to deal with that, the psychological distress that could be faced by kids. And of course, these folks who were autistic and didn't know it, or are and still don't know it, they love their kids and they want to do the best that they can for their kids. And yet, because of the disability, disrupts the communication system to a degree where they have trouble emotionally bonding with their children. And I think that that's probably what occurred with us. But there was nothing, there's no information, there's no research on it. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. I said, there's got to be tons of people out there whose parent is neurodiverse for one reason or another, and is having a really rough time of it because they don't understand necessarily how it's affecting them psychologically. So that is my impetus.
yes. So I imagine based upon that, your relationship with your dad was a bit difficult.
Yes. Yeah, it was, I think it was not difficult for me because I'm estimating that I read one study that said kids essentially have a fully formed self-esteem by the time they're 5, right? So it's by the time that they start really getting memories and are able to, talk about their feelings and so forth. So my guess is that if a parent is unable to bond with their child, that really happens when the kid is just a baby. So probably by the time I was 5, I was already shut down emotionally. So what kids do is they use whatever advantages they may have intrinsically to protect themselves. And for me, that was easy. Is that if you look at somebody, you gauge quickly what they're after, and you become that. And therefore, they get what they want, and they let you pass. Right? You're not going to be the one who they yell at. You're not going to be the one they argue with. You just slide by. And so that's primarily, I think, how I handled my life. So because of that, I was not the one who received the brunt of his distress when he would become worked up. My sister, who had ADHD at the time, and that was undiagnosed, right? You're talking in the 70s, had just a wicked time because, as you know, ADHD causes you to say things without necessarily thinking about them. You tend to confront people. You tend to be disorganized, and my dad didn't know what to do with this. All he knew is that he had a daughter who wasn't paying attention, wasn't listening to him, was showing apparent disrespect. So she got a lot more flack, and I think it was a lot more difficult for her than it was for me.
You
But
know, I'm so glad you said that because I was going to ask if you'd spoken to your siblings about what their experiences were. Because people forget with siblings, and I see this in my own family. I was raised as an only child, but my mother is one of four, my dad is one of three. You can grow up into the same household and have very different experiences as children. And I've worked as a nanny in the past and all this type of thing, and you will have four kids at the same address, four very different relationships with their parents and essentially four very different childhoods, just under one roof.
No, yeah, that's really true. Essentially, what becomes of us is psychologically is based in part on our chemistry and who we are as a person. In other words, my brain interpreted all those moments in my life in a certain way that was different from my sisters because they have different brains. That's how we humans work. And I
Right.
think probably I was the one to end up becoming a journalist and a writer because I have a very analytical brain. And it bothered me. I didn't know why. There were certain things that were missing from my life, and I wanted to figure them out. I didn't want to live with that. That feeling of I don't know why, and why am I being attacked by these periods of just being completely unhappy. And so that's what led me to really chase it down. And that's one of the big points, I guess, of the book is that it is worth chasing down because the I was able to learn so much and understand so much that my life is much happier now. And if I could give that message to your listeners, it is yes, it is painful at times, and but it is worth understanding what happened to you, where you were in that family, and all families have angst of some kind, and how you were affected. So I agree. My sisters and I, by the way, are very close. And I think one of the reasons, and I would say almost uncommonly so, because I grew up thinking, oh, everybody is super close to their siblings. And
My mother and her sister live 10 blocks apart. They have not spoken in a decade. Like,
yes, yes, yes. And when I started to hear those stories mostly in college, when I started my branching out into the people who I knew, I was shocked. Like, how can that be? And now you know how that can be is because there are a lot of unhealed scars that are take place in families. And if you don't heal them, that's the kind of dysfunction you're left with. And who wants to, you know, have that level of pain in their life? And I guess that's one of the reasons I wrote the book is I have a very low tolerance for emotional pain, and so I'm like,
I
get
mean,
that out,
I
release
think,
that
but
out.
here's the thing though, is what might be painful to one person is a perfectly workable system for someone else. In a family system, if you're the golden child, you don't care that the scapegoat is suffering. It's not your problem
Yeah,
because it's not you.
I suppose that that's going to be true, and that goes back to the thought that each person occupies a very unique role in a family,
Mhm.
and so and I guess for when it came to my dad, my middle sister, was very much the scapegoat. But at least she had the support of me and my other sister. And so that was really good. And my mom was, that was one of the things I had to deal with is that my mom was like, if you were look at her, she was just like the best person. She loved kids. She was a mom from the get-go. She, was emotional and she really good person, lovely to everybody she met. But when it came to one of the most important things, which is protecting her kids against her husband, she couldn't bring herself to do that. And so you're like, hey, mom, how come how come that happened? And so that was partly, as I was going through the book, because she was gone by then. So it's like, what do you do? How do you get over that? How do you get over being mad at that person? And then, so that was a big part of it, discovering who my mom really was and why she did what she did, which was super helpful. You know, it was,
No, no, certainly.
you know,
So when it comes to, is your dad still with us?
he is not. And
Oh,
so
okay.
I
Dad has passed
don't
on.
think, yeah, I don't think I would have sought publication for the book if he'd still been alive. I think I would have, because he does deserve my, full respect. He actually accomplished quite a lot, and it was a very upstanding member, very, very principled person. So, I would not have done that to him.
Yes. Well, what do you what if you had 5 minutes of his time again, what would you tell him?
Well, oddly, in the book, I do say, if I could have, I would have said, "Hey, we have these incidents of autism in our family. Two of my sister's kids are autistic. We have a ton of ADHD in our family, which is also considered neurodiverse condition. Um, and I would have asked him, I said, "Do you think it's a possibility that you have autism?" And my guess, he was a very, very logical thinker. And my guess is he would have thought about it seriously and he might have said, "Yeah, it's possible." So it's to his credit that he could contemplate a truth that perhaps others might think undesirable and they might push away. But that's what I would have asked him. Do you think it's
Yeah.
possible? I mean, that would have
Did
changed our lives. I mean, no
yeah.
question. If autism had been a diagnosis, if um, uh, if we had known the symptoms to look for, if we'd been able to actually talk about it, oh my goodness, the whole life would have been different. And so that's another reason for writing this book is that I want to really encourage people. It's like we've got these diagnoses now, so let's make use of them, the terms, the words. Let's start communicating more within families because it would just make families thrive to a greater degree.
Yeah. What in terms of your own life and all this type of thing, did you go on to get married and have children? And how was that different than how you grew up?
I did have I met my husband in college and we had two children, and so that's a big part of the book is that I was always thinking that autism was something that didn't touch me necessarily. It was something that my sister was having to deal with. But then I realized that it was the way in which I was raised. It actually changed my personal communication system. Having a parent with undiagnosed ASD um, definitely affected my communication system and left me emotionally lacking in terms of my connection to my kids. And that was huge. That was out of everything. That was the most painful part of all of this, the discovery of the fact of how my need to protect myself was so great that I kept myself emotionally distant from my kids. That was a it was a shocker to learn. It was just just super painful to deal with.
Yeah, I
So
want to I want to dig into that idea a little bit because you kind of mentioned this emotional distance and gap um a couple times now, and it's obviously had effects up and down the family line. Um, what is maybe walk us through what does that look like? How did it manifest? And how does it affect you as a daughter and then as a mother?
well, I think anytime you develop a really elaborate system for protecting yourself, the more layers you have, the more impaired you can become. So if I am essentially interacting with people, and that's it was the description I use is kind of like Casper the ghost. You have this empty interior and you cloak it with the persona, the public persona that you believe will be acceptable at any given time to the people you work with, to friends, to family. You're doing it with your family too. So you're presenting this mother image to your children. You're not actually connecting with them and being able. So everything was about. I better protect myself really well because if anybody pops this bubble, they're going to see that there's nothing there. There's nothing inside of me. I'm a non-person. And that is something that is you live in terror of. Please don't let that happen. And so what you do is you build that same kind of protection against from your own kids. It's like, don't come too close, don't get too close, because I cannot afford to have you show the world that I am nothing. And that's the effect. It makes you feel like you're nothing, and it's something that is a psychological feeling of invisibility and nothingness that is attributed to other psychological situations. Perhaps if a parent has addiction, for example, and the kid needs to protect themselves, mental illness, the kid feels they need to protect themselves. And so from that, it's like you don't form those really intimate relationships. I happen to with my husband, I think out of sheer luck of who he is. And I'm really grateful for that. But it's like I had to really work on my communication system. I had to because my whole thing was trying to appear perfect, which is ridiculous. But that's what I was faced with. And it was so time consuming and hard, you know? And to be able to say, oh, I made a mistake, or yeah, it was kind of a silly thing that happened. And that took me, I had to practice that. It was the craziest thing. I had to practice telling people about myself and deciding what was really I really thought about something instead of just telling them what I thought they wanted to hear. So I had to like work through all that. I had to, really, it's like, whoa, my communication system is horrible, so
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense. How do you think I don't know if you got this kind of far into it or if you've had this type of reflection, but how do you think the way that your father and your family system was broke your communication system? Because I find I find autistic people are so easy to communicate with because it's so simple, it's straightforward, there's no subtext, you don't have to read between the lines, you don't have to guess, you don't have to intuit anything. What you see is exactly what you get. And so I'm kind of curious in terms of in terms of your communication style and you going through all that you went through to get to where you are now, this like healthier place, how those kind of two things merge together. Because in my mind, it would seem that it would be easier, it would improve, but I'm also autistic, so I have odd ideas about everything.
well, I think that's a really good thing, because one of the reasons I fell in love with my husband is he was immediately a person that struck me as a person who's I was never going to have to change him or never want to change him. He was going to be straight up with me, and that is something that I didn't feel like I had at home
Mm,
necessarily, right? There was, my mom was, kind of one of millions of other women and mothers who kind of fell prey to that passive aggressive kind of system of, oh, wishy washy. Oh, you might could do that, or yeah, maybe you shouldn't, or, kind of
yeah.
situation. And my dad and I never talked really. I mean, I had no relationship with him, and it's a very hard thing if you've had a relationship with a father. I guess it's like this person who's important to you, and they've had a big imprint on you. I had no relationship with my father. He was the guy who came home and we talked politics or whatever it was, and then he went to sleep, and that's kind of it. So emotionally, there was just nothing there. He didn't know anything about me, pretty much. So he would sometimes say things that would he didn't understand what the implication was.
Mm,
And I think that that's a difference, perhaps, between uh, holistic people and autistic people is no filters, right?
right.
And often that can be a really good thing, because it's like, do you think this is ready for submission? No. And it's like, oh, okay. I know that
Yeah.
you think that that's really the answer. I get it. But when you're dealing with children and self-esteem, for example, I use the example in my book that he told me this story where my mother would come out every year for my birthday. And it was, as you would suspect, it's to come out and be with me, not go visit. But when he would want to come out, he'd want to go see things and learn things because that's what he liked to do. So he would do the obligation of talking with family
Yeah.
for a day or two, and then
Yeah. And then he's out of there.
he's
Yeah.
out of there, right? Because it's not that interesting to him. And
It's
so he
also a
said,
lot of energy. It's extremely stressful, very draining. Like it's
exactly, a
yes.
lot of
That's why with family,
stimulation.
I am in and out. I'm kind of like, oh yeah, long weekend. I'll get in on Thursday night, and on Monday I'm on a plane flying home, and it's great. Like it, yes, I could, but I can
Yeah,
also see how that would be very disconcerting, to
well,
people.
it
And
it wasn't so much that it's that he said he looked at me and he said I was offered to go with her and go on a longer vacation, we'll spend a little time with you, and then we would go off and do our thing. And so, and he said, but she always wanted to just come and see you, and I never understood why. And so the implication, now for an autistic person, you're like, well, it's a basic question. How come? How come she just wanted to go and see you? I don't get it. Whereas for a person who is allistic, the implication is you're not worth visiting. You're not interesting. You're, you know what? I don't understand why she would come and just see you. There's nothing there to see, you know?
yeah,
And that was the moment in which I realized kind of his disability. That was the moment where I'm like, okay, I get it. I understand now. Because I think there was no, in my head, I wasn't like, oh, he's trying to hurt me. I knew that he just really didn't understand how that was going to come off, you know, to a
yeah.
person who analyzes things. And so it was, but it was like a lifetime of those moments in which he more or less told me, "You're not interesting. You're not right." He didn't mean to, right?
Right. But that's the feeling you got left with. I have a
Yes.
very dear friend of mine, Pete Coogan. He and I have arguments because I always tell him he's like, you can't know what other people are thinking. He's autism classic. You can't know what people are thinking. You can't understand their minds. You can never know or understand that. And I'm kind of like, no, you can. It's called emotional intelligence and you need 2 tablespoons. and 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 I said, and he gets mad because other people try to, consider his feelings, and he literally considers that immoral. And I'm kind of like, no, that's called self-awareness of other people, Pete. Like that's a very important thing. I had to work very hard to learn how to do that over a long period of time. And he thinks I am absolutely nuts. And you can't know about other people and how they're feeling. So why bother trying or even bother to think about that? Just disregard all of that sort of thing. So I can definitely see how, this, and here's, I think, the miscommunication or perhaps malcommunication begins. Um, when you tell someone, oh, yeah, I only want to see you for X time and then I want to go off and do my own thing or whatever have you, your feeling of you're not that interesting is completely valid. That's of course, that's exactly how you would feel hearing that. In the autistic brain, we're just kind of, it's not that you're not interesting, it's just that we're jumping from hyperfixation to hyperfixation. There's a whole world of knowledge. We're trying to go here, do that, all this type of thing, and so we're off on 50 different trails all at once sometimes. And unfortunately, especially in a family, in a personal context, a lot of people can kind of be hurt in that process of sort of bull in the china shop. you know, going around doing our thing, being in our own time and space, and not properly thinking and evaluating about what that means to other people, or what just being present means, like for a major life event or whatever have you. And
I
I
think
think
you,
that's an
I think this
odd thing.
hits it right on the head. Is that you that I actually think when I was writing this, I really realized that the way holistic people, communicate is totally unfair. So I actually get the holistic mindset. If people were able to more bluntly say what they are really feeling, or experiencing, or how they think, it would be easier for everybody. But what happens with the holistic world and the is that you're expected to kind of lie about it and then figure it out. Like if you go up to somebody, how are you? Fine. And they're clearly not fine,
Yeah,
but you're
yes,
expected
exactly.
to guess
Oh,
what
right.
might be wrong, or to right, instead of just taking them for their word, you're expected to know that something is not right. That is essentially kind of like a formalized lying. So it's a really unfair system.
Well,
So I
I think
actually,
part of the problem is it's not people, the people, I mean, it is kind of formalized lying. I think, and here's the problem, and here's where I struggle is people are telling you, but they're not using direct communication or words when they do it. It's energy, it's tone, it's the vibe, it's their body language, all this type of thing. And for all the years I have spent learning about this stuff and getting better at it and all this type of thing, I'm mediocre at best when it comes to understanding all of those different social cues and all this type of thing. I only got diagnosed 2 years ago, and I'm
wow,
35 next week. Well, this is
wow,
being recorded on April the 21st. It won't come out until June, but I will have been 35 by the time the listener hears this.
right,
And I was only diagnosed 2 years ago. I'm still mediocre at best, even in terms of like, is it, is she flirting with me? Is she not? Did I, piss you off? Did I say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing? Sometimes I'm like, why are you yelling at me? I mean, it's as much as work as I have done. It's still a coin toss, kind of me trying to figure out, you know, what the problem is, all this type of thing. So I think I think it's a part of the struggle with being autistic is we're missing 90% of the conversation. Words are
yeah,
only 10% of the conversation. The 90% is intonation, intuition, body language, energy, vibes, all this type of thing. We're perpetually on the phone. We're only getting 10% of the conversation. We live life through a telephone, basically. And
yeah.
and we're just not seeing and processing all that other stuff. And and I can only imagine on the other side of it, on the holistic side, to be kind of like, I'm doing all the things, and why aren't they hearing me in the language that I'm communicating? And it's just, yeah, and our receivers are just not, our antennas are down, the power got pulled, like, we're just not receiving your signal. And I imagine that's incredibly frustrating, especially as a child to a parent when you're doing all that stuff and you're just not getting your needs met no matter how hard you try. That is devastating.
That was the hard part, because
Yes.
if the thing is that if you're when you're a little kid, and when you're a little baby and you're a toddler, and you have no means, you have no concepts, you have no words yet for things, it's like those little lessons of I'm not getting my needs met are embedded. There's no way to deal with them. There's no way to, because now it's like you can say, oh, I found that frustrating and I can use this strategy, right? But you don't have that. And it's like buried. So that's what the whole book was about, is uncovering the buried little bubbles and bursting them, with, oh, there's a reason I did all that and made all those mistakes and didn't get emotionally connected to my kids and didn't, and did feel bad about myself. There's a reason. And that is what I would like really emphasize for your viewers, is it doesn't matter what happens to you. It's finding out what it is so you finally understand and you can live with a less burdened life. And in terms of like autism in particular, we're so lucky now that there's like a diagnosis and there is tangible phrases that you can use, and parents, and that's what I'm advocating for, is if you're on the spectrum and you have kids or thinking about having kids, it's like hook up with that your neighborhood child development psychologist, because there are simple things that you can do to actually connect with your kid emotionally. Just like you said, you can get the phrases, you can explain to your kids. You can say, look, kid, this is how it is. Like if you had explained that to me as a kid, we're playing telephone and I'm only getting certain, if I would have been like, Cameron, I got you, man.
Yeah.
I understand what you're talking about, so I am not going to expect you to do X. But there was none of that. And
No.
until families talk about that, there's going to be these errors and these underlying emotional traumas that take place because their kids just don't have words for them.
Yeah. No, having the language for things is huge. I spent the bulk of my 20s um in therapy and spiritual practice. And um it was a long journey of me unpacking. I grew up in a very abusive household and I was an only child, so I was the target. Um it took me a long time to kind of unpack all of those things, see through all of those layers, and also to get old enough to understand the other side of it, and also long enough to get the language for it. I even found in my
Yeah.
last relationship, I've been talking with my ex and we've become friends a little bit, and we were kind of talking about things, and she's kind of like, "Oh wow, I wish you'd told me that, we broke up 3 years ago. I wish you'd said that 3 years ago." I said, "Babe, I didn't have the language 3 years ago. What you're seeing is the 3 years that I've spent thinking about us. I didn't have the words back then to say A, B, C, and D, and that was before I had gotten diagnosed and gone through all the stuff after that and learned so much about myself and how things were and why things were this way and all this type of thing. That was not available yet,
That's the
you
whole
know.
thing, is not having the words for it. And I actually have a section in the book which talks about that, because it comes from a culture in which you're taught not to talk about your feelings anyway, right? So you're already starting at a deficit. You don't have the
Yes.
words for, nobody's encouraging you. And I was growing up, nobody's encouraging you to convey your feelings. They're like, be quiet, sit down, be quiet, don't cause trouble.
I grew up
That is the,
religious. No, I mean, I grew up
yeah,
religious of very conservative people. My mom's from West Texas. My dad is from Wyoming. Children were to be seen and not heard, and
yeah.
preferably not seen most of the time either. And I grew up in the, late 80s, early 90s, when parents locked their kids out of the house all day and, to clean and have alone time and whatever have you. Well, very different from how people parent now. And, and so, yeah, it's a very different sort of thing, very different economy, very different attitude, very different ideas, and we've come so far, but
In some
I mean,
places.
in some places, yes, in some places, no. I definitely look at my own life and been like, wow, if I had known this at 18 years old, I would have made completely different decisions. I would have never gone to college. I would have never gone to grad school. We probably wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation right now. Because a lot of people in the ASD community end up working small time retail jobs, whatever have you, and kind of jump from thing to thing to thing. Um, and I spent years
Yeah.
kind of beating my head against the wall trying to figure out, why does every system in society seem to work for everyone else but me? And then
Mm,
2 years ago, I found out.
yeah.
So, which is why we do this. So,
Yeah.
yes, no, it's a very difficult thing. And I think when on that a piece about emotions, I think one of the tough parts that I think is tough for people around the autistic person is, and I have this argument with my ex. She is full of desires and cravings and feelings and blah blah blah. There's a lot going on all the time, and I'm like, that's nice, can't relate. that's not where I live. Like it's like that's just not where I live. Like like feelings come along in like big tsunami waves, but the ocean's usually pretty calm.
Yeah.
And I see that in a lot of, especially male ASD people. Like the emotion chip just didn't get plugged in. People call us Spock in data for a reason. Like,
Yeah.
because just that facility just isn't there. And I think that's also quite difficult. And I can see how adapting to that sort of flat affect and all that sort of thing would just permeate into every other part of your life. That's really tough.
It is, but the thing also that's interesting is that for your listeners, if they're not sure, neurodiversity actually encompasses there are um, uh, I don't know 15, 20 at least, and sometimes the number depends on kind of what resource you're going to, but
Oh.
encompasses a lot of mental health problems, learning disabilities, behavioral disabilities, which is ADHD, and then physical problems like stroke, Down syndrome.
Mhm.
And so, and one estimate I read is that 1 in 20 people is neurodiverse. Now, 1 in 20 people means that they're all around us. We're in this ocean together. The people who are neurodiverse and the people who are not, we're all moving around to each other. And it's not the people over there. And it's not
Yeah.
those people asking for extra resources costing our society more money. It is our grandma and our kid and our sister. And so if we can get that feeling like, yes, some people need more help. And not only that, we need to be speaking more clearly to each other. Going back to your point about that, then are going to be doing a lot better, right? We're going to be, if I was able to, as a little kid, give you those phrases, so you're able to explain to me, yes, even though you're talking about all this stuff, I don't feel any of that. Good, that's a good thing to know, right? Giving
Yeah.
them the words and so forth. We're going to just be a lot better. It's really hard to be in neurodiverse families, you
Yes, it
know?
is. Absolutely. And I think I mean, family dynamics are tough enough already, but when you have brains that are built differently, um, that adds an extra layer of complexity. But I mean, thank goodness it's 2023. We're having these
Yes.
conversations. You've written your book. We're talking about it now. This stuff is finally getting out there so that people don't just struggle along like we did, sort of thing.
Yes.
We're finally getting to that place where it's like there's resources now, there's stuff you can find now, there's conversations being had, and it's so important.
Yes, especially with, and I understand there's still some difficulties. Like assessments can be very costly for people. I don't
And
know if
long
you,
waiting times. I got lucky.
right.
I was in between two clinics. One was a 16-month wait,
Oh,
and the other one that I went with was a 5-month wait. And the only reason it was 5 months is because they had just opened and their list was
uh,
short. But it still was like a 5-month wait sort of thing. So yeah, it's and I was lucky to be able to find someone that took in my insurance, all this type of thing. I had a dear friend from back in the day who was trying to get her son assessed and diagnosed, and it's anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000, if not more, not
right.
always covered by insurance. Finding a doctor that's both available and takes your insurance is its own challenge. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yes, it's a lot. So that's one of the things that would be very helpful for neurodiverse families if they is that they can get assessment easier and less cost would be very helpful. Parenting classes would be great. If my dad had parenting classes, I'm sure he would have adhered to it because he was a logical guy. If you told him you got to do X X X, he would have done that. He would have held me for whatever amount of time they said was good time to hold a baby. He would have looked into my eyes, which is what they say is really good for bonding with kids. He would have talked to me. You know what I mean? The basic
Yes.
things like that. And uh, um, and because you can see, it's like you'd always be. It's like from somebody who is maybe autistic, they might, look at me and say, "Hey, stop complaining about us." But I'm like, "No, no, we're together. We're together. It's like your situation is my situation, and we are together in this." And it's getting that feeling of working together that is really, I think, really important. It's not an us them thing. It's a we're
Yeah.
all in this.
No, quite. Well, this has been a great conversation. We're coming up to the hour. So, why don't you let us know where people can find the book and where they can connect with you online?
You can essentially order the book at all major retailers online. It's Amazon, bookshop.org is for independent bookstores, Barnes and Noble, and it's on pre-order now. And you can also go to my website, which is marthaengber.com. So,
Wonderful. Excellent.
yes.
Thank you so much, Martha. Thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you, Cameron. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.